Free weight resistance training in youth athletes results in significant increases in strength, power and agility, and decreases injury risk. Consequently, Stephen and colleagues in their narrative review provides us with some evidence-based recommendations for youth resistance training. This presentation, brought to you by Talking Sports Science, will be a summary of their recommendations. In their review, Stephen and colleagues provide resistance training recommendations in relation to maturity status. This is because it is possible for youth athletes to be at the same chronological age but differ greatly in terms of their biological age, which is defined as the stage of an individual's physical growth in relation to skeletal, sexual or body attributes. Broadly, the stages of maturity are pre-peak height velocity, and post-peak height velocity. We will now briefly review these stages. Pre-peak height velocity, the relative low concentrations of testosterone and growth hormone during pre-peak height velocity limit the capacity for skeletal muscle structural adaptations. Therefore, during this stage of maturation, increases in strength and power from training are primarily a result of improved neuromuscular activation. A significant phase of growth starts in girls between 9 and 12 years old, and for boys a few years later between 12 and 14 years old. In relation to biological maturation, this equates to approximately 1.5 years prior to peak height velocity and can last 6 months to a year post-peak height velocity. Moving on to peak height velocity. In this phase, peak rate of skeletal growth occurs. The timing and speed of biological maturation is highly individual, and therefore it is an important fact to consider when designing a training program. Post-peak height velocity. Although there are large increases in strength and power during peak height velocity, the greatest gains tend to occur at onset of peak weight velocity. This is typically between 6 months to a year after peak height velocity, where the rate of lean mass gained is greatest. We will now look at the different forms of training focus. Firstly, fundamental movements. Irrespective of age, a resistance training program should focus initially on correct technique of fundamental movements, such as squat patterns and hip hinge. This will provide a solid foundation whereby strength development can then be periodized within a long-term athlete program. Moving on to weightlifting, the clean and jerk and the snatch and various weightlifting derivatives involve high force and velocity outputs. Weightlifting, therefore, has the capacity to improve muscular power by utilizing the explosive lower body triple extension, which is essential for many sports. Despite the complexity of weightlifting, it can be an effective method to improve athletic qualities in young athletes at each stage of biological maturity, with minimal injury risk when appropriately supervised. And last but not least, traditional resistance training. Developing strength through traditional resistance training methods can positively influence powerful sporting movements. We will now review the recommendations. Recommendation 1. In this phase, foundational movements should be emphasized. As strength fundamentally underpins power, it is important to begin to develop general strength while concurrently introducing the technical skills required for weightlifting. In terms of volume, 1 to 3 sets with 8 to 10 repetitions is recommended. Load is irrelevant, as the priority is technique proficiency. Moving on to recommendation 2. Now in this phase of maturity, load can be introduced to weightlifting movements, and the intensity of traditional resistance training can be increased. A volume of 2 to 3 sets with 6 to 8 repetitions and a load of 70 to 80% of 1 repetition maximum is recommended. Moving on to the third and final recommendation, recommendation 3. In this phase, technically able and physically mature athletes should undertake high intensity resistance training using traditional and weightlifting movements. To maximize neuromuscular adaptations, leading to positive changes in physical performance. A volume of 3 to 4 sets with 1 to 6 repetitions and a load of 70 to 100% of 1 repetition maximum is recommended. And that concludes the recommendations. The key take-home message is that resistance training is an important aspect of a young athlete's development and is a safe and effective method when appropriately planned and supervised. Thanks for listening, folks. See you next time.